Mr. President, I rise today to discuss an issue that people back home are talking about a lot. We're discussing the federal government's need to plan for the increasing levels of marine debris that's hitting the Pacific coastline, whether it's out in Hawaii or all the way up north to Alaska. This debris that is coming from the earthquake and the tsunami that struck Japan last March. This, again, is something that as folks are out fishing, as people are out walking our beaches, it is a subject of great discussion and debate. We all know that that tragic event claimed nearly 16,000 lives, destroyed community infrastructure, homes, livelihoods. Our prayers continue for the ones who we have lost and those who have lost their loved ones. Now, as horrifying as these natural disasters were, we remember that earthquake. The ground shook from anywhere to 3 to 5 minutes. The tsunami rushed to the shore and then receded. But the devastation to property that we saw move out from the shores there in Japan, the devastation to property on other coastlines continues over a year and a half later as we begin to see the debris pile up on our shores over here. Now, the Japanese government has estimated about 5 million tons of debris were carried out into the ocean. We are assuming, or have assumed, that the majority of that either sank or will sink, but there's really no firm estimate, no concrete idea of how much is still floating or when it will reach our beaches. But in Alaska, we know that it has been arriving. We saw the first evidence of it last winter, and it arrived ahead of the projected timelines. It's probably understandable that we were not able to anticipate exactly when the tsunami debris would start arriving, but now that we're starting to see it along the shoreline, I think it's no doubt but that we need to respond. Last January, trying to get ahead of the curve, if you will, I held a roundtable in Anchorage to find out what our state and our federal agencies were doing to prepare for the debris that we knew would be coming to our shores, how the interagency work would be coordinated, how individuals could report sighting and navigational issues. I think I've mentioned on this floor, I have 2 sons that are out on a fishing vessel in the Gulf of Alaska. As they crossed the Gulf, would they encounter debris from tsunami? We saw at one point in time a Japanese vessel that was literally a ghost ship, a relic from that tsunami. The Coast Guard took that vessel and got it out of the navigation channels. But as Alaskans and people that live on the coast, we're very aware that when there is stuff out in the water that is uncharted that we don't know about, we want to know and understand a little bit more. This past June, I joined the U.S. Coast Guard to see for myself what was washing up on some of Alaska's remote shoreline, our beaches. We flew out of Cordova, Alaska. We went out to Kayak Island. Kayak sticks out from the coastline at an angle that allows it to collect an incredible amount of marine debris on just an average year. So the reason to go to kayak was to see what else might be unusual other than the typical marine debris, the nets, the ropes, the buoys. We saw real evidence of what was coming our way from the tsunami. We saw colored buoys. We saw large styrofoam blocks. There was a large container that had washed up very recently. We've got a picture here from NOAA that shows some of what we saw washed up there on kayak. These are all the plastic buoys here. The black ones, we were told, are are what you see more of coming out of Japan. Now, have we been clearly able to identify that these came from Japan, or this was the usual marine debris? NOAA is working to sort all of that out, but that gives you somewhat of an idea of some of what we saw out there on Kayak Island. Now, many saw pictures of this huge dock that recently arrived on the coastline in Oregon. Just looking at the size here, recognizing that this concrete dock that had flotation on either end traveled all the way across the Pacific, literally in one huge slab of a piece, washing up onto the Oregon beach. I think folks looked at that picture and the word was, wow. And again, if you're a navigator, if you're a fisherman out there and you run across this in the water, real evidence of why we need to be concerned. This next photo is one from the Pacific Ocean, somewhere out in the Pacific. This shows the objects that are creating, again, a hazard to navigation. These same materials, they're going to end up somewhere, on some shoreline, whether it's on our beaches, in our ports. Think about the impact that they may have on sensitive habitats, making them unusable, certainly deadly for certain marine animals, shorebirds, other species that may rely on them. I think what's important to recognize from these three pictures that I've just shown you is what we're seeing now is the debris that is floating on top or at least partly out of the water. And we're seeing it coming to U.S. shorelines earlier than might have been anticipated because in addition to the currents from the ocean, it's being moved along by the wind. And so what we're seeing in Alaska primarily are those buoys that sit clear up out of the water. But you can see fishing boats, building materials, roofs. Again, this is what we can see because it's above the water. One of the real questions that we need to ask is, so what's below the water? What's just below the surface that we can't see at this point in time? Now, a couple weeks ago, I met with some representatives from the Yakutat-Tlingit tribe from Yakutat, Alaska. Yakutat is in northern southeast Alaska. It's the northern part of the Tongass National Forest on the eastern side of the Gulf of Alaska. It's a very remote community. It's only accessible by air or by boat. The closest community is hundreds of miles away. And again, it's surrounded by the Federal Park Service and Forest Service lands. So what this community is doing, the tribe, the city, the borough, they're meeting weekly to assess the debris that's coming up on their beaches, and they're trying to put together a response. They've done some cleanup along 15 miles of area beaches. There's a beautiful, beautiful beach called Cannon Beach. It has black sand. It's absolutely gorgeous. I visited it in March. And now what we are seeing is again the styrofoam, the housing foam, the buoys that are coming up on the beaches there outside of Yakutat. They estimate that they've got about 600 pounds of marine debris per mile. The borough has 1,074 miles of coastline. So as a small village community, they're looking at the possibility of, say, 3,000 tons of debris. This next picture here is actually from Yakutat. And this details another problem that our coastal communities are facing. And this is, what do you do with this marine debris? Because our landfills, particularly in southeastern Alaska, our landfills are maxed out or close to being maxed out. The landfill space is filling up and could very, very quickly be overwhelmed by tsunami debris. So not only are they are they tasked with cleaning up beaches that are very rugged, very remote. Most you simply cannot access. There is no road to access. You can't land a vessel or a boat on the shoreline because in far too many areas it's just too dangerous. So how do we access this? That's one challenge. It's costly to do is a second. But also the challenges that we face with now that we've collected it, what do we do with it? So they're exploring some pretty creative solutions, some alternative disposal solutions. This is a community I've reported on before, excuse me, extremely Yakutat is one of those communities that has extremely high energy costs. I believe, if my memory serves me, I believe that they pay in excess of 50 cents a kilowatt hour for their energy. So when they're dealing with challenges and problems, much of it comes back to their high cost of energy. So what they're looking at is whether or not there's a potential for any waste to energy technologies that could deal with two problems: clean it up and support long-term efforts to deal with the high cost of energy. So it's kind of a twofer. You figure out how you can turn this into an energy source, and you can also support long-term community marine debris cleanup efforts. So you've got this small, remote community really on their own, facing a beach full, truckfuls of debris. Now, the state of Alaska has engaged in tsunami debris coordination. I'm told the Alaska region representatives of the federal agencies are as well, but headquarters of agencies across the federal government really need to be part of the plan and to engage creatively as we address this accumulating debris. Now, we're a state. I don't have my typical Alaskan map up here that I usually do when I speak, but as a state with incredible coastline, more coastline than the rest of the country put together, we depend on our marine resources for sustenance, for livelihood, recreation. We value a healthy coastline to support a resilient marine environment. Our fisheries, our tourism, our coastal communities they're so dependent on a strong and sustainable region. And I mean, think about it from the tourism perspective. When somebody is paying thousands of dollars to come up to Alaska to visit remote and wild areas, they're certainly going to be disappointed if they're greeted by a beach full of styrofoam or pass by these mini debris fields. Communities up and down the coastline really need some assurance that headquarters of various agencies are going to be part of the cleanup plan. Think about what happened after Hurricane Katrina. FEMA compiled a document denoting the debris removal authorities of federal agencies. And that document kind of outlines the Departments of Agriculture, Commerce, Defense, Homeland Security, and Transportation. They all had a role to play in debris removal. So for this reason, and using this as an example, I've asked the White House to establish and to lead an interagency task force to plan for tsunami debris. So you take the relevant states, tribes, local governments, and the international partners and invite them to participate in this task force. We all need to be working it together. You just cannot leave a little community like Yakutat and say, clean up your section of the coastline there. Now, I know private and government Japanese representatives have expressed interest in helping with the debris problem. The ability for Japan to offer experience and technology with waste-to-energy devices, I think, could provide a great opportunity for U.S.-Japan and public partnership coordination to come together and address the impact from the debris. Now, there are many reasons that we need to be acting now. It's probably a difficult time of year for us back in Washington, D.C. here to think about winter storms. We're enjoying some pretty warm weather back here, but what we need to recognize, what we need to think about is what winter weather in Alaska will mean for accumulating debris. We've got a lot of areas that are already impacted by tsunami debris that have huge tide swings. So you add to that winter storm and wave action. And in areas with beaches, some of the debris that we see will be buried deep by the sand, only to be uncovered while snow conditions and spring breakup make accessing the coastline really very challenging. We've got extreme tides, and then, of course, the weather will also move the debris up into the tree line, making access and removal even more difficult. This last picture down here, I think, will give you some indication. You can just go ahead. Some indication of what I'm talking about when you think about the Alaska coastline. This is in a part of the state called Montague Island off of Kodiak. But what you'll see is with good high tides and just the weather that we get, trees that have just come down that are part of the ocean accumulation come up to the shore. But you can see tucked in, kind of sprinkle like confetti, some of the styrofoam that has washed up, again, this marine debris that we're seeing. But think about how difficult it is to get in and access some of this after these winter storms that we see. When debris lands on rough and rocky shorelines, wave action is expected to break that up. We know that happens, but I'm already concerned about our marine life and birds and animals, marine animals, consuming these smaller plastic particles that have been broken down by the wave action. Allowing a chunk of styrofoam that's easy to pick up today, when you've got reasonably good size pieces, you can go ahead and pick that up. But it's going to be much more difficult to do that when it's been broken down by wave action. So again, all of this argues for prompt action. Now, maybe the best that we can do for now is just pick up the debris and store it somewhere. But as you saw, looking at the Yakutat picture, storing it in a landfill in most of these communities is probably not going to be feasible. Baling technology could be available to Alaska communities for about $10,000 for a baling machine that would at least support the voluntary cleanup efforts, provide a means to store the debris rather than forcing strained landfills to absorb the incoming debris. I throw this out here because I think it's important that we get creative about this. We need to be exploring all available technologies to support the most efficient means to handle this tsunami debris and other marine debris for the long run. Every year I attend an annual renewable alternative energy fair. It's held in the interior part of the state. It's at Chena Hot Springs. You always learn something good and new at this energy fair. Last year, when I was there, I saw a device that's actually in production. It's on-the-shelf technology. It may help turn much of the debris that's hitting our coastline into fuel. The device, I called it a gizmo. I know there's a much more technical term for it, but it processes plastics into fuel with a capacity to produce as much as 2,400 gallons per day, with fuel at over $6 a gallon in Yakutat. The people there are looking and saying, wow, you could actually take some of the waste, the garbage, the debris, the plastics, turn that into fuel so that I don't have to pay $6 a gallon to fuel up my four-wheeler, my truck, my boat. Now, given the tight budgets that are all around the country, again, I think we need to be creative here. We need to identify and deploy all available resources and share information. We need to leverage local knowledge and our coastal residents' proximity to and vested interest in the cleanup efforts. Now, our federal agencies have regional coastal staff, and they've got facility resources. Many run programs that are consistent with the objectives of tsunami debris response and mitigation. And for those who would suggest that, well, if it's come up on your shore, it's your responsibility. There's no federal role here. It's up to the states to figure it out. I would remind them that in my state, much of our coastline is owned by the federal government. This picture here on Montague Island is entirely within the Chugach National Forest. The first picture that I showed you on Kayak Island is in the Tongass National Forest. So in fact, over 60% of my state is owned by the federal government. Clearly, the federal government has a role to play in cleaning up the debris. Now, we also can't forget about the private interests in cleanup. Many industries and private citizens are dependent on our navigable waterways and healthy marine ecosystems. We need good communication, leadership, and a plan to guide an interagency and public-private approach to solve this challenge during what we would all acknowledge are difficult fiscal times. I commend the NOAA Marine Debris Program for their coordination in response to this work, but the fact of the matter is, Mr. President, they are a small and an overtasked program. They need help of their federal partners to address this as a national priority. So I would encourage my colleagues to join me in recognizing that marine debris is a national problem as well as a priority, and a comprehensive response to the tsunami debris that we're seeing on our shoreline in Alaska and other Pacific Northwest states are seeing, in addition to Hawaii. Comprehensive response is past due. With that, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.